This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. I'm very happy today to have as my guest George Gilder. George is one of the most insightful thinkers on technology and society, and has been for many decades. He's a prolific writer. He's the author of numerous books, including Wealth and Poverty, Men and Marriage, Telecosm, Life After Television, The Scandal of Money, Knowledge and Power about information theory. So we'll talk hopefully a little bit about that. And more recently, Life After Google and Gaming AI. He's an investor and advisor to numerous high-tech firms. He's the author of the Gilder Report. He is a social philosopher, a futurist, an avid runner, and I just learned is a cross-country skier like me, so that's good, my favorite sport, and more. So George's work really addresses the intersection between technology and the human person, especially human creativity. So you can find all the show notes, links to resources, including all of George's books, his website, newsletter, etc., at themoralimagination.com. Thanks to all of you who've written reviews and for support the podcast on Patreon. So today, George, first of all, thank you very much for being on the Moral Imagination.
Delighted. I'm feeling imaginative.
Well, you always are. So I want to talk today about a couple of things. I mostly want to focus on your book, Life After Google, and your newest book, Gaming AI, which I enjoyed. And you make this claim, right, that could be seen as audacious or bombastic. You say that the Google era is over, right? And just like television was replaced by the computer and the smartphone, the Google system of the world with its centralized servers is going to be replaced by a new system of the world based on decentralization, the blockchain, and what you call the Cryptocosm. Why don't we start with the big theme? You say the Google system of the world's over. What is the Google system of the world, and why do you think it's ultimately going to fail?
Well, the Google system of the world feeds on advertising. And we all know that the advertisements that they deliver to us are not really ads, they're minuses. And you pile up increasing numbers of minuses with ever larger cloud computing resources. And in the end, you lose. The Chinese companies that compete with Google is not free of competition. It has major Chinese rivals such as Alibaba and Tencent are two companies that are virtually as big as Google now, and they collect almost all their revenues from actual payments from subscribers and customers, rather than by fooling people into imagining that all these minuses are ads, all these insidious commercials that clutter the internet now and clutter your access to Google's wonderful search engines and wonderful capabilities. I'm not an enemy of Google. I think Google has a lot going for it still. It's probably America's leading technology company, but it's subsisting like the television empire on fooling the people. And the people can only be fooled so much of the time. And we want authentic facts and authentic products, and we want to pay for them rather than be spoofed for them and cluttered with them. And that's the essential vision, that Google, because it relies on advertising that people don't really want to see, they resemble the television empire, the top-down television empire that I predicted would collapse in Life After Television.
So one of the things you say, right, and like Jaron Lanier and other people say this as well, that free is bad. Free is not a good thing. And so
free is a lie.
Yeah, so let's develop that a little bit. Like, so is a lie because of why?
Because it denies the real costs that must be exacted when any product is transmitted or sold or propagated. It hides the costs, falsifies the process. So you have less pure process of increasing knowledge and learning, which all economic growth is. And you have this effort to pretend everything can be free and that people don't have to pay, except ultimately with their freedom and identities and property rights and all these other real considerations that so offend the American left.
So here, a couple of things, maybe let's follow on that. So one is, and I've made this case on Kieran Lanier, other people, but as I read Lanier's book, and I've had him on this podcast as well, I was thinking about this, and I think you've talked about this before, but that when you buy something, right, there's a contract that's made. So if I buy you something from George, if I pay you money and you give me the thing, we have a Gesellschaft, right? We have a type of community. It's thin, but there's a contract and there's something back and forth between the two of us. And so I sometimes liken it to like the foreign aid problem, right? Where if you give me something for free, if I give you something for free, I don't have any responsibility that comes with that.
But you also have less information transmitted. My information theory of economics is essentially based on three propositions. Wealth is knowledge, and we know it's knowledge because the Neanderthal in his cave had all the physical resources we have today. The difference between our age and the Stone Age is the accumulation of knowledge. Thomas Sowell saw this in 1971. But if wealth is knowledge, growth is learning. And learning occurs according to Popperian rules. That is, that unless propositions can be falsified, they don't contain real information or engender learning. So growth, all economic growth, is really various learning processes. And then money is time. And I believe that this current era is trying to escape these constraints. And I think that reduces learning and ultimately stultifies an economy and retards economic growth.
I think this is something that maybe we could develop too on the point about prices, how prices are part of information, right? Yeah. And you talk about money is a measure, right? Money is a measure of time. It's also a measure of value and a measure of other people's work. And so, I'm jumping maybe a little bit ahead. I want to talk about some of the philosophical critiques you make in a little bit more detail later. But I think right now we see it, that there's a misunderstanding in the Google vision of the world that doesn't take work and prices seriously, right? So when you go through those ideas that Google says to be true, right? Everything should be free. Information should be free. That there's a lack of realization of the value of work. Could you develop that a little bit, especially from a philosophical view of?
Well, I think it's, I'm focusing on money as time. In order for money to function, it has to represent the time that workers spend earning it. And I believe in time prices, that there's a system of time prices that William Nordhaus of Yale developed years ago, but didn't really pursue. And now two economists, Gail Pooley of Brigham Young and Marion Tupy of Cato Institute in St. Andrews in Scotland, are really developing time prices as the way to compare the value of goods and services around the world and to define the real value of money. And that means you can get away from all these inflation indexes, all these GDP deflators, all these international monetary exchanges, and $6.7 trillion a day of currency trading. It's all falsifying money and allowing central banks around the world to steal from the future in order to subsidize consumption now. And I think it's really reaching a crisis today as the entire American economy is being devoted to an utterly futile and self-destructive effort to eliminate CO2 from the atmosphere. It's just totally fruitless and based on fallacious science, and in order to aggrandize a world of experts who the administrative state, if it can control the use of energy everywhere, it really can control everything. And it's followed by this healthcare state, which is currently mandating that we wear masks everywhere we go and get tested for some transitory flu every time we turn around. Millions of times a day across the country. And these are really egregious violations of factuality and truth. And that's the crisis of life after capitalism, which is the book I'm writing now.
Okay, so I want to go into, there's a number of things there, but one of the things I want to go into is just a little bit more on money. So you talk about this, that this leads to the cryptocurrency element, which we're going to get to. We're going to talk about Bitcoin and Ethereum. But why don't you set out the problem of money right now? And maybe let's go right into why cryptocurrency is a possible solution to this problem, why you think that.
Well, I think the cryptocosm, the cryptocurrencies are really, and the blockchain beneath them, is really the solution to the two major crises in the global economy. Mm-hmm. And one is the collapse of internet security. I mean, nothing is secure on the internet. It's a giant copying machine, but you have no idea of the significance of the copies or their validity. And every year we spend more on internet security and experience more hacks and more thefts and more ransomware and more phishing. And so there's a crisis of internet security. And there's a crisis of global monies, signified by the $6.7 trillion a day of currency trading that doesn't even establish secure values for particular currencies. And both these crises reflect the kind of runaway materialist relativism that is sweeping the world. And blockchain establishes a time-stamped record of transactions, of facts, of licenses, of contracts, of databases. It actually creates a ground state. And all learning and growth depends on a secure past, a secure ground state, and a moral foundation. And these are all fostered and enforced by blockchains, which distribute facts and transactions across the net and the economy, and thus make it impossible to steal one. By capturing one critical point in a network, you can steal and falsify anything in the existing internet. But if all the transactions of the economy are stored immutably on each blockchain in every node of the network, then you have to capture all the nodes of the network at once in order to change any particular one. And that's the real genius of blockchain. And that's why it establishes a ground state for transactions and computations and factual records, and prohibits the kind of eclipse of the past and moral nihilism that is currently pervasive on the net and in the world economy.
Let's maybe then pause for a second and have you develop a little bit about those 2 points. Number one, maybe articulate a little bit for the listeners. What do you mean by a ground state? And I do want to, let me say, I do want to talk about cryptocurrency, but I also want to talk about, a lot of people stop and think, okay, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, Ethereum, et cetera. But what I'm actually more interested in,
Bitcoin isn't a very good cryptocurrency. It just has a first mover advantage as a speculative asset, but it's not well conceived to be an actual currency for transactions because it has a cap on the total number of units. And thus, if you restrict the total number of possible units of a money, all changes in its and demand for it have to be expressed in its price rather than in its supply. And this was Milton Friedman's great error that he recognized toward the end of his life. And this great error was adopted by Satoshi for Bitcoin, unfortunately. And so Bitcoin is a speculative asset rather than a possible replacement for global transactions. And I think there's going to emerge from the cryptocosm new forms of money that actually do recapture much of the virtues of a kind of liquid gold that can provide a reliable ground state for an information economy. There are a lot of complicated ideas here, but I think it really comes from understanding that the whole internet, all of computer science, is based on information theory. And information theory also governs economic activity and measures it. And information theory is the heart of computer science, networking, technology, and monetary theory as well. It's a unifying theory.
Okay, so let's pause there for just a second. I'd like to go back to Bitcoin. And as I said, one of the things I want to talk about is blockchain beyond cryptocurrency. So for example, block stacks. And I think that there's a real place for decentralized computing. I'd like you write a lot about this. And I think this is something that's really important to address some of the problems you set out. But maybe let's pause for a second and take a little bit of time to talk about information theory. It's super complex. You wrote a book, Knowledge and Power. You talk about Claude Shannon and Pierce and all these different ideas. Could you maybe just give a pretty broad summary of what information theory is and why it's so important, and it's something that most of us miss?
Well, Claude Shannon in 1948 really published the first key essays on information theory, which defined all information as he first conceived the bit and the byte, and conceived all information as unexpected bits and bytes. In other words, he measured the information in any transmitted message as inhering in its surprisal, in its unexpectedness. And that if everything I say to you today, you already know, there is zero information being transmitted. All information is surprise and unexpected bits. Just as all real economic growth is unexpected creativity and invention, because creativity always comes as a surprise to us. And so this identification of information and the growth of knowledge as surprise really refutes all the dreams of a determinist economy planned ahead by socialist experts or by any regime of fixed knowledge. In order to convey unexpected findings, though, you do need a low entropy carrier, a predictable carrier. And that's money as time, constitution, which provides predictable laws and guarantees predictable contracts and networks that are governed by the electromagnetic spectrum, which is in turn regulated by the speed of light, and thus always allows you to read the information, the stream of the message. Entropy is information in Shannon's terms, and it takes a low entropy carrier, constitutional government, moral regularities, rules of law, to bear unpredictable creative messages or creations, entrepreneurial creations.
And that's for him, that's the high entropy, right? High entropy is the surprise. So the way they sometimes explain, when I think about, say, for example, I directed a film for the Act Institute called Poverty, Inc. And so when I sometimes think about poverty, I'll use that image from you, which is that in order to have entrepreneurship, innovation, surprise, that's high entropy. You need rule of law, free association, freedom of exchange, right? In order to families, yeah. Jennifer Roback Morse has done her book Love and Economics, and other people as well have talked about the importance of family as a low entropy stability, so that you can have lots of innovation. Okay, so that's the basics. I mean, I know that information theory is complex. That's a short version here on the podcast. There's a lot more. I recommend everyone get George's book, Knowledge and Power.
But Life After Google expounds the full theory too in the context of these issues that are everywhere being debated now about the role of the high-tech companies and the social networks and knowledge platforms and search engines.
So that's good. Let's go back there to this thing. So one of the things you do in your book in different parts, and you've done this in speeches I've heard, you make a contrast between Google's vision of the world and the Cryptocosm's vision of the world. And maybe what would be helpful is, why don't you explain your idea? One of the things I think that's so interesting about the way you work through these things is you're always taking philosophy seriously. You're not separating it out. And so that there are deep, you and I, neither of us is a materialist. So there are deep, like, materialist assumptions that undergird a lot of contemporary technology. So let me ask you a question. You can correct me. I was talking to some people recently, and I think a lot of people, especially who are not materialists, maybe who have a conservative tendency, have tended to identify digital technology and equate that with, say, the Google Burning Man system of the world. Yes. But they're not the same thing, right? In fact, that's a limited, one could argue, while there's been a lot of incredible innovation, that actually there's some limits on that innovation. And if we actually had a richer philosophical understanding and a richer understanding of the human person and creativity, it could actually yield better digital technology. What do you think about that? You think that's wrong? What would you say?
No, I think that's right. And that's what I wrote the book about, was the path to a technology that transcends the materialist superstition and rule of the administrative state and the dominance of experts and the eclipse of democracy and Republican government, constitutional government. It's all part of my argument.
Okay, so let's get to the question of cryptocurrency and blockchain. So I'd like to start here, and that is this. I mentioned it before. We have this idea of Bitcoin, Ethereum. Can you talk a little bit about, say, how can the blockchain and, say, block stacks be used beyond cryptocurrency to help decentralization? So I'm a big fan of Robert Nisbet, and I think decentralization is really important. And we live in a very highly centralized time. Yeah. And I think that needs to be both a philosophy of decentralization and then practical decentralization through, say, mutual aid societies, right? But that technology can actually serve this and undergird this. And there's a place there in the blockchain. A lot of this course on the blockchain elements I used to learn from you and others. Can you articulate that? Like, how would you explain that to people who maybe think like, wait, what's the connection because they think digital technology is highly individualistic and kind of narcissistic? How does the blockchain and things like block stacks, like Munib Ali and his work, and how do those things serve, say, more human-centered communities and decentralization? How do those things work together?
Well, the blockchain is the ultimate decentralized database. That's what it is. Rather than having databases controlled by big institutions like banks and social networks and search engine companies and other top-down entities, blockchain allows the distribution of knowledge and power across the economy in a way that can't be nullified or reversed or falsified. And that endows individuals with new power over their own creations, over their own information, over their own money, which is earned by their own expenditures of time in the economy.
Yeah, that relates to in your kind of in your analysis of the cryptocosm. You say that the Google idea is that I'm looking for the one you say that there's always more information out there. We can get it by giving things away. But you say, no, in the cryptocosm, information should be owned by their creators, right? Not by the distributors.
Yeah.
And that there's this respect of proof of work of the customers, right? And then you also make this point about information, right? So that the Google idea is information cross all borders, and the crypto idea Cryptocosm is you say respects the borders of your computer security and that it's the property of the user and not the device or the network. And I think this is something, the idea sometimes a lot of people say this, but right, that when you put something on Google Docs, it's on their servers, right? And you talk about this as well, that the blockchain enables there to be this decentralized system where you actually own the property, you have control of the property, and then it helps you with monetizing. Could you develop it out? Like, give maybe some examples of what could happen that would be different from today's system that you see, say, in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, crucially, the emergence of money like gold beforehand, which until 1971 was the foundation of all money, was gold. And what made gold money was that over the millennia, the time it took to mine another ingot never much changed. As more and more technology and capital was devoted to extracting gold from the earth, the gold to be extracted became more and more attenuated and hard to get and expensive and costly in time to extract. So you had a foundation of the value of money. But gold is not a very useful transaction device. It's rooted in time, but it's cumbersome to manipulate and distribute. So what the new money will be is just as reliable as gold. It can't be changed or falsified, but also will be as easy for transactional uses as cash. It'll be better than cash because cash is not demonstrable. Cash gives you anonymity, but what's more important is it doesn't give you the ability to document that you didn't violate the rules or didn't break the law or didn't owe the tax or whatever the claim is. It's as liquid as cash. And in China, 95% or more of the transactions are now done directly from cell phones in digital form. But it also allows you to document in an unimpeachable way your actual behavior. So if you get charged by the government with avoiding taxes or perpetrating some kind of violation of government rules or whatever, you can perfectly and unimpeachably document your actual behavior. And that is a big advance over cash, and it's one of the great contributions of cryptocurrencies.
And this also, as you said earlier, that's central to the blockchain is that it's a distributed system, right? So It's not, somebody can't, like if it's not, say the bank couldn't falsify anything, because in order to falsify it, you'd have to falsify it on every single node of the decentralized system. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, so let me ask you two questions off that. So one is, I think that's really the idea of real clarity, that you have a record, right, that can't be changed.
And this applies to patents or to contracts they allow the transcendence of national borders. And now we have this chaos of $6.7 trillion a day of currency trading, constantly muddling and disrupting values all across the world economy and giving new powers to centralized institutions and central banks and governments and treasuries. And if facts can be ground states for economic activity are held in blockchains, it means that this blockchain time-stamped record can be global and can allow the emergence of new global economy that doesn't eclipse private rights and collectivities of national activities still can happen, but individuals are capable of trading across the world without being regulated and suppressed by national entities that imagine that trade is somehow a zero-sum game that should be mastered by states and central banks.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things off that. I mean, I think this idea of trade, one of this interesting to me is thinking about, poverty, and the work I've done with economics in the developing world is property rights, right? It's hard to get title to your land and have clear title and show clear title. A blockchain could show title so that a poor person can't be simply expropriated by, say, a wealthy person,
right,
who might have political connections and could falsify records. So that's one thing. And I think, it's another interesting, some of the work of people like Balaji Srinivasan, who talks about this.
Who's this?
Balaji Srinivasan and his idea of cloud cities. And he also says things like, there's bad rule of law in some places. And so this gives the ability for people to operate outside of, say, to move, to migrate, but also to be, in a sense, remote and not simply beholden to that. And I think that's an opportunity. So I have a question. I mean, it seems to me, maybe some people will say, well, that's, I often say this. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would say, some people say, well, you can't stop the state. I say, listen, if SEAL Team 6 wants to get you, you're done. Okay. But that's maybe the bad mental model, right? We're looking at, in a sense, I sometimes say the better mental model is like, there's an ice storm and you got to be prepared for it, right? And that this gives the opportunity for people to, in a sense, build with these clear records in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. Okay. So do you think that's generally right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Let me be devil's advocate and say, but isn't that just kind of a techno-utopian solution to a human problem? I mean, we have a human problem of mendacity that is from the beginning, right? I mean, this is a problem we have. How would you respond to somebody who says there has been, the victors write history. History has always been mendacious. It, to some point, meaning it excludes certain elements. How can a technical situation solve that? Do you think that's techno-utopian?
Well, I don't think it can solve it, but at least recognizing truth is a foundation to any solution to the problem of human civilization. And blockchain doesn't solve it, but it's a vehicle to provide an immutable record that isn't controlled by centralized organizations or administered by the state or by government bureaucracies, that is held by the citizens of the world and of the nation. And that is the value of blockchain as a tool. And it's based on a top-down, a hierarchical understanding of the universe, that we're creative in the image of our creator. We don't live in some determined materialist world governed by physics and chemistry. We live in a creative world where we respond to the laws of creation and of a creator, and creativity always comes as a surprise to us. This is the real rule of capitalism, that if you could predict everything, if economies were determinist reflections of physics and chemistry, then there would be no information and no creativity, because creativity is surprise, it's news, unexpected contributions, and they reflect creativity in the image of a creator, of a divine creator. And that is essential to the overthrow of the materialist superstition that currently dominates and stultifies our universities.
Okay, so let's actually talk about that then for a little bit, the materialist superstition. And, I'm a critique of materialism. I think it's incoherent. Yeah. But you talk about this a little bit in your book. So you talk about Kurt Gödel, and you talk about this in Gaming AI as well.
Gaming AI, that's where but also Life After Google.
You talk about it in both places, right? So there's a critique of Gödel and singularity. Could you talk about that? And also, I have a question. I'll throw the question out now. Gödel's critique, it somewhat resonates or it seems to echo the kind of, this is what I talk about on the podcast all the time, but it really does echo this. Ratzinger's critique of rationalism, right? The idea that the only empirist rationality is the only way to have reason. He says, well, you can't prove that empirically. And that there's this deep incoherence at the bottom of it. Could you talk about Gödel and his critique and why it's important, and then maybe how that relates to this contrast with, say, Kurzweil's notion of singularity?
Gödel, I think, was the most important mathematician of the 20th century. I mean, until Gödel, people imagined that ultimately the world was a determinist arena, that if you knew all the position of every atom or molecule in the universe, you could predict all its future and know all its past. And that this is the determinist superstition, the materialist superstition. And mathematics was going to be the instrument by which scientists could fathom this foundation of reality, this inexorable, determined foundation of reality. And what Gödel proved was that mathematics itself is necessarily dependent on propositions that can't be proven by the mathematical scheme. And indeed, he said every logical scheme is dependent on propositions that can't be demonstrated within the scheme itself. And Gödel is an important figure because Gödel, to prove this point, essentially invented computer software. He showed that all the propositions in a logical system, such as a computer operating system or computer architecture, are all dependent on propositions outside the scheme itself. And thus he showed that computers themselves can't possibly be minds. Computers are necessarily dependent on what Gödel's follower, Alan Turing, described as oracles. These are essentially programmers of the computer, and you can extend the computer program as much as you want, but it will all ultimately be dependent on a further computer programmer to supply the intelligence to the system. So Gödel is really the paramount thinker of the computer age because he envisaged computer software programs as a way of proving that no logical scheme can be self-sufficient. And he was afraid, as he said at one point in his life, I rather fear that I've proven the existence of God. And so this was an unexpected product of Gödel. And people now try to use the computer to prove that human minds, are essentially just computers that can be usurped by artificial intelligence. And Gödel proved that even a computer itself can't escape the need for an outside mind. And certainly the universe couldn't escape the need for an outside mind. And this is the ultimate refutation of the materialist superstition.
But this really impacts the way people think about artificial intelligence, right? I mean, so the idea that somehow, and Kurzweil talks about this, but there's this kind of materialist evolutionary notion, right? That everything's matter and that this thing called the human person emerged. Correct me if I'm got this wrong. I mean, this is very unnuanced, but that this thing called the human person that has consciousness emerged. And so if that's the case, if we can create computers based on this image of the human person, and you make the point that the way that we've conceived of the human mind is based on the computer, which is erroneous, but that if we can do that, then these machines will become conscious and they'll kind of take off and take over. And then you talk about this in your book, like Max Tegmark and a number of people are worried, Elon Musk, about this kind of hyper super intelligent computers that really, in a sense, become conscious and take over, as it were. That's a fear of a lot of people, but you say it's just wrong right from the get-go. Can you explain a little bit?
Well, part of it was explained by Charles S. Peirce, the great philosopher, mathematician at Harvard early in the century. And when he declared that reality is not binary, it's not expressible implicitly in bits and bytes, in binary connections between symbols and objects, and between maps and territories. Maps are not the same as territories. Symbols are not the same as objects. And so no matter how fast you make a computer process bits and bytes, you can't eclipse that necessary gap between the symbols that it's shuffling and the objects which the symbols represent, whether they're words representing things or numbers representing quantities or whatever it is. The map is not the same as the territory. So you need a triadic organization. And the triadic organization has the object and then the interpretant of the object that connects the object to a symbol. And the interpretant really represents a consciousness. And that consciousness is the root of all thinking and mind and intelligence. And what artificial intelligence tries to do is nullify the interpretant and just assume that the symbol and the object are the same. And that is a great fallacy. And it means that these computer systems, no matter how fast they can compute, and they can do wonderful things. I'm not an enemy of artificial intelligence, but begin by stressing that it is artificial and it's not really intelligence. It's certainly not mind. It's dependent on outside minds to give it meaning and purpose and will and imagination and moral vision and everything that renders life and intelligence meaningful.
So here you depart pretty strongly from Ray Kurzweil, and you've done essays and books together with him, where he is the head of artificial intelligence at Google. At least he was. I think he still is. And he has this, idea that you can create a mind, right? So, yeah. But I'd like you to go through that. But maybe two things. One, people would say to you, well, look, computers have defeated human beings in chess. They've defeated human beings in Go. You have now, deep learning where AlphaGo, right?
AlphaGo, and Google calls its AI division deep mind.
Deep mind, right. And that this idea, okay, so that it's just given the rules and then it learns and plays all these games. And so you make this point yeah, of course, machines are better at human beings in some things. That's what plows are. Plows are better, right? Cars are faster than human beings. But maybe develop what somebody says, well, come on, George. I mean, they can beat human beings at Go. Why is Kurzweil wrong?
Well, defeating human beings at Go or any game is just an effect of the game being a symbol system. The game, by definition, is connected to any outside reality only by its human players. So, of course, shuffling symbols at 1 billion times a second or whatever that the computer can do will allow it to arrive at the symbolic outcomes, but the connection of each symbol to reality in any real-world operation, not a game, is the computer's impotent. Its connection to the outside world, its connection to actual experience, imagination, the conception of alternative possibilities, alternative realities, all these features of imagination and counterfactuality and vision, and is all part of the domain that C.S. Peirce called the interpretant, which is consciousness. And I believe it reflects a greater consciousness, a divine consciousness, transcending the determinist material element represented by the symbol system in the game, whether it's bishops and kings and queens and rooks and pawns, or whether it's black and white stones and Go. Or, and this is really valuable, whether it's translating the symbol system of the genetic code into particular forms of proteins. The meaning, the purpose of the proteins or what they're doing is not, but the information comes before the outcome. The information has to be provided to the system before it can calculate these outcomes, such as protein folds or game results.
So there's a couple things that as you talked, it made me think. One is it's really interesting as you talked about like an outside consciousness, right? Would be divine consciousness.
Yeah.
I've heard a number of people, I think you've talked about this before. I've heard, people, for example, who are materialists come to this sense like, wow, maybe there's like this fundamental program at the center of the universe, or aliens did it. I mean, you've heard this. And I was talking to somebody about this, St. Thomas Aquinas in his 5 proofs for God's existence, always, he says, he'll give like a proof and he says at the end, this is what we call God. And he's not making the case yet, he does later, for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or for, Jesus as the incarnate God. It's just like this kind of, this is what we call God. And it's interesting because I'll even hear materialists talk who will come up with like aliens, I said, or this kind of internal meaning at the center of the universe that's almost divine-like, which is, I think, an interesting phenomenon. I don't know if you have a comment on that. As you were talking, I thought that.
Well, I think that it's aliens that are, this is the kind of bizarre kind of idea that people arrive at when they believe in the materialist superstition. Rather than believe it, as Chesterton once put it, people who don't believe in God don't believe in nothing. They'll believe in almost anything. And all you have to do is go through the propositions that are solemnly upheld by prestigious scientists to understand the bizarre character of many scientific beliefs, such as multiple parallel universes. In order to explain the singularity and infinite improbability of the particular universe we experience, they assume that we're just one of infinite numbers of parallel universes. And in order not to believe in one God, they believe in infinite numbers of parallel universes generated with every movement of a molecule in our universe, and unreachable or undemonstrable by any empirical test. It's just complete stultification of science based on the idea that the existing universe, our existing world, our own creation is just a random expression of material fluctuations through time. It's absolutely corrupting, and I think it is misleading Silicon Valley in a fatal way to believe that that your whole goal is to create an artificial intelligence that will usurp human minds. You have a nihilist vision, a nihilist, suicidal vision for the future of humanity. And it's preposterous. Artificial intelligence in no way threatens human minds. It's just a completely absurd idea. If you know just how computers work, existing computer scientists have just forgotten their entire history and the philosophy pervading their history, and the source of their greatest triumphs is all using machines as tools to enhance human possibilities and capabilities rather than using machines to usurp them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting about this kind of connection. I think about this a lot, about oftentimes we forget, like I sometimes say, like we have no recollection or idea of the sources of our wealth, right? I'll give the example, like, I have electricity in my house. And so I think, oh, well, I'll go down to your house and wire electricity. Well, no, I have wealth in the United States. We don't know sometimes where things come from. But I also think you said something that's important related to just like to neuroscience. So I've had Dr. Michael Egnor on this podcast twice, and we've talked about some of the main errors in neuroscience, right? And I said this a little bit earlier, but you make this case that, many computer scientists and AI developers use the human brain as a model for AI. But you argue that the problem is their concept of the brain is erroneously modeled on computers and a reductionist view of computation. So it's circular.
And a circular loop. It's, you model the computer on an image of the human mind based on a computer. So, of course, you can, as computers advance, they're going to become human minds by definition. But the fact is, we don't understand human minds at all. It's amazing how sterile are our models, materialist models of human intellect. And, in my book, Gaming AI, I work on a field called connectome studies.
And yeah, I was about to ask, that's in my notes. Yeah, let's talk about that.
Connect studies emerged at MIT, and they're focused on biology, all the connections in a human brain, and beginning with the brain of a worm and projecting it onto human brain. But connectomes were very familiar to me because a connectome is essentially a schematic for the global internet. And so the connectome of the global internet would be represented by all the connections across the global internet. And in order to map all the connections across the global internet, you count them all up, all the nodes and switches across the net. And it takes about a zettabyte of information to map the connectome of the global internet, and thus by extension, a global human society.
A zettabyte is 10 to the 21st power, right? So it's
10 to the 20 with 21 zeros. I mean, it's an almost inconceivable number of complexity in the global internet. And there are probably several zettabytes of information now attached to the global internet. And I thought this was pretty impressive. And to run this global computer across the global internet with its zettabyte of complexity, essentially, takes gigawatts of electricity, just hugely energy using technology to sustain this global internet. And meanwhile, consider the connectome of the human brain, of one human brain, and with all the dendrites and axons and synapses and connections all across one human brain. And the scientists I've forgotten the names. They're in Gaming AI. I give the details of it. But a single human brain takes about a zettabyte of information to map. Just to get a map of all the connections in a single human brain takes a zettabyte. In other words, a single human brain is virtually as complex as the global internet. And yet the single human brain runs on 12 to 14 watts of energy, not billions and billions of watts like the internet. And all the connections across a single human brain, and you still don't have any idea of what the brain is thinking or what it's saying or what it's imagining. So, and a friend of mine, Tony Strutton, who is a great mapper of connectomes at the University of Wisconsin, he started with the connectome of a worm. And he said he thought, when I understood the connectome of the brain of a worm, that I would actually understand how the worm's brain functioned. But now, after 20 years of mapping the connectome of the brain of a worm, I've forgotten the name of the worm, but he says he knows no more about how the brain of the worm functions than before he started. And Strutton's work is cited by Kurzweil and all the people who are trying to build computers that replicate human brains, which are assumed to be compound millions of worm brains or thousands of mice brains. And it's really a futile pursuit. And it's futile because the fundamental difference between symbols and objects and the need for an imaginative interpretant to render the symbols significant and to apply will and purpose and imagination to reality. Yeah. In other words, supply a consciousness that reflects the consciousness of our Creator.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One, just I have some notes from that, which is amazing. It's I probably won't pronounce this correctly, but it's the Caenorhabditis elegans is the name of the worm. And it's amazing because I think there's like 7,000 connections or something like that. The human brain, you write, has 100 billion times larger than the worm. Yeah. And it was Sebastian Sung of MIT. This was amazing. He said, and this is from your book, page 34, I think. He says that a single cubic millimeter of brain tissue yields about a petabyte of image data. And that's a digital album of 1 billion slides. And our brains are 1 million cubic millimeters, right? So a single cubic millimeter is 1 billion slides. Our brains are 1 million cubic millimeters, which is, as you say, a zettabyte of data. So that was at the internet of 2017, about the same at 14 watts. So it's remarkable. But I think you bring up two issues, and we can maybe just touch on them. And they're very, very complex. But one of them is consciousness, and the other one is free will. And it seems to me, and I have an episode with Michael Egnor on kind of neuroscience and free will and some of the way that people like Sam Harris have misinterpreted Benjamin Libet's studies. But maybe we could talk about this. Do you think underlying the artificial intelligence idea is that, what's the vision of will and consciousness that Kurzweil has or others have, we'll call the Google vision of the world? What do they think about free will and consciousness? Do we not have it? I mean, where do they stand?
Well, many of them believe we don't ultimately have it, that somehow what we imagine to be free will is an optical illusion of some kind. Their reductionist view of the materialist superstition, reducing everything to the laws of physics and chemistry, eclipses free will. And the Israeli philosopher Harari,
right, he thinks death is a glitch.
He thinks that's that we probably don't have free will. That if, and there are various experiments that show some physical movements actually precede the decision in the brain to activate.
Right, that's the Benjamin Libet study. Which, by the way, I interviewed Mike Egnor on that, and it's very interesting because Libet does not conclude what a lot of people say he concludes. He actually concluded there was free won't, and that this didn't demonstrate free will. But anyway, go ahead.
They're all. It's just complex beyond what we understand. I mean, if we reduce everything to a determinist model, then we'll find a determinist model. But that act of finding represents act of free will by the investigator. I mean, it's Gödel really did explain this problem. He proved that this idea that somehow we can import determinism to any of our systems is spurious. It's unsupportable mathematically. When you approach any kind of the extremes of any computation, you fall off Gödel's incompleteness cliff. You have to resort to Turing's oracle. It's just a fact of life and mind that was thoroughly demonstrated by the very founders of the science of computation. And the effort to reverse those findings and somehow find some determinist model is just an act of faith that far exceeds any upheld by a religious believer in God. There's a terrific new book by Stephen Meyer that's Return of the God Hypothesis. He's got a trilogy on Darwin's doubt and the signature in the cell, and now the Return of the God Hypothesis. And he just shows essentially that materialist science is a great superstition. It's an assertion of irrational faith to support the opposition to religious morality and religious prophecy and religious belief. And it makes essentially belief in monotheism, a single God engaged in nature and the universe and the creator of it, makes a lot more sense than the belief that some random process ultimately eventuated in the birth of Ray Kurzweil.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think, David Berlinski, as you know, writes about this, the God delusion and other things.
Yeah.
And David Berlinski is not a believer, I don't think, but he just says, a lot of this kind of atheist superstition. But I think it's interesting because it's almost like it only works if...
Well, I think David does believe in it. He just wants, as a scientist in that debate, he rejects any premises that he can't fully prove. So that's his method. That's application of the scientific method to the scrutiny of scientific propositions. But what he actually thinks is another question.
Right.
And people should differentiate between those two, the strategies of the scientific method and actual personal beliefs.
Right.
You couldn't get out of bed in the morning without some belief in meaning and purpose and possible free will and accomplishment.
Right.
People really believe things they may deny in the classroom.
Right. And I think it's interesting. I mean, we talked about this with Egnor, with Sam Harris, that the whole idea to make an argument that free will doesn't exist is a self-refuting position, because if free will doesn't exist, you can't convince me to change my mind. But the other thing that's striking is just the oracle thing. I haven't thought about this maybe in this way before, but the oracles have to be those kind of like proponents of this materialist worldview. So I think of E.O. Wilson, for example. E.O. Wilson has this line, it's paraphrased, that morality is just something fobbed off on us from... It's an illusion, I think he says, fobbed off on us by our genes. Now, the question is, well, how would you know that? Right?
Yeah,
I mean, you'd have to be the oracle. And so this is the interesting thing is like, there's almost like this is a new word, oracleification, to make oneself an oracle, right? That has to take place. So it's this, I think it's with Gödel, I think it's with Ratzinger's Regensburg address, that empiricist rationality on its own can't hold it up because you can't prove that empirically. So it's always held on these deeper foundations. But I think what do you think? I wasn't going to ask you this, but what do you think? Why is this so attractive? I don't get it. I mean, so let me just say, I don't get it. I just find it so utterly incoherent, because you just go back to like, well, how do you know that they were fobbed off, right? How do you know? You keep going back. And as you use Popper's like falsifiability or David Berlinski and scientific method, these positions ultimately become fideistic positions that are...
Become what kind of positions?
Fideistic. They're faithful positions based on less evidence than, say, for example, Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs for the existence of God, or Anselm, or these traditions, or the question of order in the universe, or human experience, our lived experience. Like, why has materialism overtaken so much of this arena, when you argue that, in fact, Gödel's, the foundation of it, is non-materialist? Why do you think it's so attractive?
Because people really want to escape the burden of a moral universe, of a possible divine judgment, of actual meaning and consequence in their behavior. They want free love, free money, free behavior. And that's why they don't want to think that nothing is free, and that everything is rooted in divine consciousness that pervades our lives and realities.
Interesting. I think also there's you kind of address that when you deal with the Burning Man philosophy, which is so much part of Google. But I was also, as you were talking, I was thinking earlier that there's a materialist superstition, but there's also, I think, a deep misunderstanding of...
A hedonist. A hedonism is a form of materialism. It tries to reduce all human behavior to the quest for pleasure, and pleasure is defined as physical gratification. And so all economies are driven by the drive for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. And this allows you to reduce everything to some kind of materialist regularity, which I describe as a superstition.
Yeah, I think, two things. One, I was going to say is...
hedonism, pleasure seeking.
Right. I think one thing that struck me is it goes down also to this, like you think about the connection between neuroscience and computer science and this materialism is that there's not a recognition of what in the tradition would be called hylomorphism, right? That we are embodied persons, we're ensouled organisms. We're not simply, there's like a bad dualism that gets in. And so there's a really great book, I don't know if you've read it, by Bennett and Hacker on the philosophical foundations of neuroscience, where they kind of go over all these conceptual errors that underlie neuroscience.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have not read that. Who are these guys?
Bennett and Hacker. So it's Bennett is a neuroscientist out of Sydney, and then Hacker, PMS Hacker is a Wittgenstein guy out of Oxford.
Okay.
And they have two books. One is The Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience, and then the other one is The History of Cognitive Neuroscience. But which
one should you start with?
I would start with The Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience. I think it's excellent. And I think they go through, they say one of the big problems we have in neuroscience is that we have what they call a mutant or degenerate Cartesianism. And so they had some dualists like Pennington and Libet and some other guys, right? But the contemporary neuroscientists, most of them are basically Cartesians, but instead of having mind and body, they have brain and body, right? Yeah. And so it creates these conceptual errors that Bennett and Hacker argue really distorts a lot of the studies. So I think it's a great book. I recommend it. Yeah, the other thing I thought about.
So rather than dualism, we need Trinitarianism.
Or hylomorphism, right? Well, I mean, I don't
know what hylomorphism is, but Trinitarianism and understanding that reality is tripartite and includes a divine pinnacle. That may be hylomorphism. What's hylomorphism?
Yeah, so hylomorphism is like Aristotelian and St. Thomas, this idea of matter form, that there's a substance. In fact, I'm going to do a whole episode on hylomorphism. But it's matter form substance, so that it's combined. So maybe the way to think about it in simple terms is it's not a dualist approach, that we are a substance of matter and form. So we're an ensouled organism. So we're not driving around in our body like we drive around in a car, right? Yeah. We don't have our person inside us.
I think maybe Peirce has a more elegant expression of that essential insight of the triadic nature of reality and humanity.
I'm always skeptical when it's more elegant than Aristotle or Aquinas, but I'm going to. No, but
this sounds like some modern Greek neologism.
Oh no, it's old. Yeah, it's actually from the Greek.
Hylomorphism.
It's from the Greek. I'll send you. I'll send you.
Yeah,
I'll send you a link on
it. Greek, but the Greeks didn't state it.
So, all right. The other thing that struck me that you said, right, I thought was kind of interesting, is I interviewed a guy called Carlo Lancelotti, who's the translator of the philosopher Gusto del Noce, and Del Noce made a point that related to this. That he said that in the 50s. I think I've talked about this in other episodes, but in the 50s, there was a switch from the resistance against the Soviets from, say, a Christian bourgeois rooted in the fact that it's good, et cetera, to this pure bourgeois move where we actually accepted as the framework of our success a hedonistic model, that we can beat you not because of moral goodness, but because we can be more productive. Yeah. So it's interesting that as you were talking, you said, it's like this sense of kind of a hedonistic desire for the most gratification possible. And Ratzinger makes this point too, where he says, after the fall of the Soviet Union, relativism didn't die, but it combined with the desire for gratification to form a potent mix. Mm. And in a sense, if I hadn't thought about this right, but that's aligns quite a bit with the Burning Man vision of the world.
Yep, it does. It's sort of mystical subsidence into the flows of random nature, and pleasure.
Okay, so before we end, I would like to ask just a couple back to this. I have a couple of maybe quick questions for you.
Okay.
One of the things on the blockchain and for Bitcoin is that you're mining and it requires a lot of energy. How do we think about energy? I was listening to an interview with somebody saying, this is going to change the way we think about energy. Where energy. We don't need ports as much as we need, waterfalls for energy. What do you think? Is energy an obstacle here? How should we think about this connection?
I think I prefer time. Energy, I ultimately think that the money as a measuring stick will rely on measuring time. And I think that escapes this expenditure of energy. I don't worry about the expenditure of energy. I don't think there's any threat to the climate or any essential fault in using a lot of energy to create a new financial system. But the particular way this system is evolved to be, where miners are camping beside waterfalls and glaciers and moving to Iceland to escape the heat dissipation problems of Bitcoin mining. I think ultimately we'll discover a more elegant way to create the proof of work that's needed in order to have a monetary system that doesn't dissolve into just random thefts of the future by central banks, which is currently what's happening. It's governments are just, we had a gang of masked men and women occupied the White House in preparation for making another robbery of the central bank. And
let me ask you this then about, so energy, because I know it just was a question because of the how it, so you think there's going to be maybe a more elegant solution to that? Because energy is a problem right now for Google servers, right? You write about that in the book. I mean, they're using a lot of energy and a lot of heat. Let me ask you this question. You talk a couple times about block stack and Munib Ali's work, and I think Ryan Shea, right? Can you explain a little bit about block stack and why you think this is such an important move?
Well, I think Blockstack is a very good project. And it turns out probably to have been chiefly an academic project. It's making some progress, I gather, but Ryan Shea has left it. And I believe that Blockstack provides a very good model for creating a new internet based on the Cryptocosm, based on blockchains. And I think their concept is correct, and many people are competing to implement it more successfully than the Blockstack team may have done. I hesitate. I describe Blockstack because they very lucidly expounded their analysis that unifies the new ground state for global money and the new ground state for internet factuality, and in one kind of system. And I think they are proceeding with it, and they raised enough money to keep going, but it's not clear that they're going to win now. So I wouldn't put too much stress on Blockstack itself. It depends. All these experiments will depend on what kind of genius can be applied to them in future years. And there are thousands of experiments underway. And just as the experiments that produce the World Wide Web and the internet and Google search and Alibaba auction platforms and trade and Alipay and all these various technologies, there are lots of failures for every one success.
Right. What about Hedera, the hash graph idea?
Well, that is also in a similar state.
It's a different
concept, but it ultimately resolves to the same insight that Shannon himself provided when he unified cryptography with information. And one system is designed to protect information from invasion and falsification, and the other system is to facilitate the transmission of information. And what happened is that these two worlds divided, and we had the internet as a gigantic copying machine where nothing could be proven, and that emerged as a lot of chaos and clutter and enormous numbers of valuable services and quarter the value, half the value of the U.S. stock market, and cryptography, which actually provides ground states and foundations. And I think the new era will see a convergence of these two elements of Claude Shannon's information theory, thus allow the creation of both a valid money that is objective and as a measuring stick rather than a magic wand for central banks, and a transactional system that is time-stamped and immutable, which also can be a storage system for facts that unfold over time and that can't be reversed or distorted.
And also, just it doesn't it also create the if there can be software and applications built upon this, like these, you have control over your data in a way that you don't have to use somebody else's server. You have a lot more privacy. It's decentralized. Is that right?
Yeah, you have more privacy. I think there is too much concern about privacy. The idea that, the fact that Google has, this utterly incomprehensible flood of data that somehow that if it's processed through some machine learning programs, they can invade your privacy in some terribly dangerous way, I think is misconceived. I think the reason Google's results are so unsatisfactory, the reason that its ads are all mostly resented and ineffectual is because they don't invade your privacy enough. They don't know what you really want. It's just another form of television, where they try to anticipate what you might want, but it's when you actually look at the results, you realize how crude they are, and you feel offended that they don't understand who you are at all. Much of the belief in an invasion of privacy is a product of inadequate sensibility and knowledge. But I do think that it is important that you be able to document your behavior and prove what you've done, and that you can't be falsified by some remote bureaucracy or hierarchy. And that is vital. And I think blockchain does confer that possibility.
Yeah.
A ground state.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we've debated this before. I'm more skeptical on that. But okay, so George, thanks for your time. I'm a little bit more worried about privacy. Maybe I'm. Hopefully, you're right, and I don't have to be. So, but I'm not sure. But so thanks for your time. You said you're working on a new book called Life After Capitalism.
Yeah.
Any other big idea that you think when people think about life after Google or AI? What the key thing to help us think about it clearly? What would you say, if there's one thing you take away from this work that you've been doing for years and years, what is it?
Well, it's going to be an information theory of economics, that the same information theory that illuminates biology and genetics and computer science and all these networking architecture, the same theory that originated largely with Gödel and was elaborated by Turing and Claude Shannon and was developed into the internet, can also be used to understand economic activity. And it's all based on surprisal, unexpected bits, that if something is predetermined, like by a socialist plan, it can't produce growth, because growth consists of the increase of information achieved through learning. And learning requires the possibility of falsifying a proposition. And that's the secret of capitalism, is that every capitalist venture can fail, and thus impart learning even through failure. And when governments try to guarantee growth, they actually stifle growth, because growth is not the unfolding of a determinist random scheme. It is unfolding of creation, surprising creation in the image of the ultimate surprise of our creator.
Okay, George, thanks. Yeah, so information theory economics. I think that's an interesting way to think about it. So, George, thank you again for your time. I have all the links to George's books on the website, themoralimagination.com. You can also find George, of course, looking him up. Appreciate your time, and I hope you have a good skiing session.
Thank you so much. Hope you do too.
Thank you.